Welcome back. We're discussing the ongoing APEC summit and what we can expect as leaders of powerhouse economies start meeting. To continue our conversation, I'm joined from Beijing by Sitao, the chief economist of the financial consulting group Deloitte China. With us in the studio is Senior Associate of the Asia Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars, Shihoko Goto. From Sydney, Kerry Brown is Director of the Chinese Studies Center at the University of Sydney, and also here in Washington, D.C. is Christian Mier, a Senior Fellow with the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Shihoko, earlier on, Christian spoke about the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. China is not part of that. Will that come up for discussion? Because now we're hearing that China wants in on that agreement.
Absolutely, and it felt that it was a deliberate ploy to keep it out initially. Now it wants in. But now it also has an alternative. They have two alternative plans, in fact. One is the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, and another one is the FTAP, the FTA for the Asia Pacific. In both cases, China is taking a leading role, and the United States is not there. So this is an opportunity for China not just to host this event, but also offer alternative visions to a mechanism, to a value system that has been in existence since the end of World War II. And we've also talked a little bit about the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. That is also another Chinese vision of how the global economy, the global financial system should be set up, reflecting new realities. And there will be a lot of competition to see who sides with who. And if I could also add, given that there is some trepidation about TPP actually moving forward, this could also be an opportunity for China to sell its vision to those who are not part of TPP.
Right. So if I could just come in there, I think I fully agree, and I think the key of APEC this year is that for the past 2 or 3 years we've seen a challenge to the US-led order from a hard power status, with China's Navy and China's Coast Guard being much more present on the seas in Asia. But with APEC and over the last few years, with things over the last year with things like AIIB and RCEP and various other free trade issues, we're seeing a challenge in the soft power of the US in Asia as well. And rather than succumbing to the US-led regional order, China is offering an alternative China-led regional order where it will be at the center of both economics and geopolitics.
Right, you mentioned, both of you mentioned the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. Kerry, I want to get your take on this. Tony Abbott, the Australian Prime Minister, said that yes, Australia would like to join this bank, but it must be what he said would be a multilateral organization, and it had to be more transparent, like the World Bank, he said. So what is Australia looking at? It seems that Australia has got two views on this.
Well, I mean, I think Australia wanted to be part of it, but was lent on by America, so it's not part of it at the moment. It would make a lot of sense if it were part of it. I mean, China as a source of capital in this way is pretty obvious. I mean, it's got plenty of capital, and it would be better to integrate that into the global system. It might even entice China to think about liberalizing its capital account, more quickly. All sorts of strategic reasons why you'd want to engage China in this way. So I think it's a pity that Australia isn't part of it now, because at least if it's around the table, it can influence it. Now it's going to be a sort of passive bystander, and therefore will not have a strong voice at the moment.
Okay, Mr. Xu, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, I think the Australian perspective actually makes sense, because in the long run, China cannot rely on all this initiative. In the long run, it's in China's best interest to open up capital account, so we don't have to accumulate so much foreign reserves, and we don't have to be in the situation relying on government agencies to source investment project. But unfortunately, Australia is not going to be in that part of the scheme. So I hope Australia can be that part of the scheme, and so that the fund can be run on a more commercial basis.
Go ahead, Kerry.
Well, I suppose what this kind of makes clear is, in fact, at the moment, Australia doesn't really have a foreign policy about China. I mean, it can't really unilaterally make its decisions. They're still made in Washington. So that's an interesting thing that we've learned, I think, even in the last week from this, really, is that Australia does not have a policy on China. It jointly runs one with America.
So Australia has outsourced its foreign policy to Washington.
Yeah, that's a reality. Yeah.
Right. You wanted to say?
I think there are high expectations from some quarters for China. But when we talk about, for instance, infrastructure development, there's also a lot of concern about the ulterior motives of the Chinese government. And not only that, but also should countries actually borrow from this new bank, whether the conditionalities would be so low and that the ambitions and expectations would actually not be met in the long run, so that it would actually lead to short-term gain, but longer-term decline of a recipient country.
When you say ulterior motives, what are those motives?
Well, I think, for instance, China is already a member of the ADB, the Asian Development Bank. It's actually the third largest shareholder. It had been frustrated with its shareholding, and there had been a lot of debate about increasing that share, also in the shareholding in the World Bank and the IMF as well. It wasn't going to change. So this is their opportunity to say, okay, you guys aren't listening to us. We're going to establish our own bank with our own rules, and we're going to have 50% of the shares of this. So that is the kind of control that they will have. So when we talk about transparency and we talk about openness, it's very clear who the leader is and who the rules are going to be set by.
And I think it's no coincidence that China has set up an infrastructure bank, along with now 22 other countries in Asia, 21 other countries in Asia. But they set up an infrastructure bank at the same time as they developed policies like a new Silk Road that would lead from China eventually through the Middle East to Europe, and a new maritime Silk Road that would involve a series of ports around the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia, which need infrastructural investment as well. So they are providing the means through the AIIB to have the loans to underdeveloped countries to build the infrastructure necessary to help China's trade, and therefore, in the longer term, China's influence within Asia.
All right, Mr. Xu, one other country that's going to be at the summit, and that is Russia. Vladimir Putin's going to be there. He's been facing sanctions from Western Europe and from the United States, but seems to have found a friend in China. I mean, there's that gas deal that was signed not so long ago. There's also talk of running a pipeline from Sakhalin Island to Hokkaido, which will provide up to 20% of Japan's gas needs. So is Russia now looking east?
Yes, indeed. I think Russia is always going to feel snubbed in Europe. I think that's really the reality. I think countries in Asia, to be frank, are simply more pragmatic. I think China, Japan, all included. Russia was the first country President Xi Jinping visited after he became the president. Of course, Russia right now is going through a rough patch, so I suspect President Xi is going to reassure Russia China is not going to be a fair weather friend. Energy security is extremely important for China, and I don't need to remind you, we in China have all underestimated the negative impact of the environment, and we can't burn coals in the long run. We need a clean energy, and we simply don't have that, and we need a steady supply of cleaner energy from countries such like Russia.
Christy, what is your view on that, this changing relationship between Russia and China and Russia and Japan? Obviously, the Russians have turned away from Europe. They realize they're not going to get anywhere there.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should be a little bit careful in our assessment of how far Russia is able to turn away from Europe. I mean, there's a very strong Europhilia still within many of the Russian elite, both business and political. Russia is attempting to pivot to some extent to Asia as well, because there's great economic growth that it needs to harness. But it's not like it's developing just a simple strategic alliance with China. It's also trying to develop energy relationships with Japan. It's selling as many weapons as it possibly can to Vietnam, which is obviously not in China's interest. So it's trying to play as many hands in Asia as it possibly can, rather than developing just a single Russo-Chinese relationship. And I also think that events in Ukraine and events in the European Arctic as well demonstrate that Russia is going to struggle to completely detach itself from Europe in any way. It's still reliant on European revenues for its energy and therefore for most of its governmental revenues. It's still much geographically closer in terms of population, in terms of business to Europe as well. So there is a pivot to Asia happening, but I don't think that means it's turning away from Europe in any particular way.
Okay, so Kerry, we have all these changing relationships, not as strong as one would imagine, as Christian just pointed out, but what is the view from Australia on those changing relationships?
Well, I mean, in the whole of history, when have China and Russia managed to get on for more than a few years without having a big argument? So I don't feel too uneasy that they're having this sort of, kind of thaw at the moment. But I mean, it's not a relationship based on any deep strategic common aims. It's on a relationship which is, mutually identifying what they want and getting it from each other. But that's very pragmatic. It's not, I mean, anything deeper than that. And I think also for APEC, what is the point of APEC? Well, it's really one of the few times when this region sits down, multilaterally and tries to work out what it is. And it's complicated politically, economically, in terms of levels of development. The members of APEC are all very, very different. It's one of the few groupings where Taiwan is present, and that's kind of, one of the few times when you get Taiwanese and, mainland Chinese to really sort of talk. So I think it'll be interesting to see if anything happens on that this time. But it's also really trying to say to the rest of the world, what is the cohesion within this region, trying to find that kind of elusive common point that I think is often very difficult when you're standing outside to work out why are these people talking together, what are they trying to do, where is the commonality, where's the common market here.
Talking about cohesion and finding common ground, Japan, tense relationship with China, close ally of the United States, although there is a tense relationship on a personal level between President Obama and Shinzo Abe, we've heard. So what will Japan be doing at the summit?
One of the biggest hopes that the Japanese have is to actually have this bilateral meeting with Xi Jinping. That will determine whether it's successful or not. The other issue is to stake its claim in the changing status quo of the region. China's narrative is more to talk about a almost G2 type of world order where China represents Asia and the United States represents the Western powers. Japan does not want to buy into that idea. I think it's trying very hard to rally other countries, especially the ASEAN nations. And this will be an opportunity to actually show that kind of alternative vision that China has to the region.
Let's go to Mr. Zhu. A G2 vision for the world, Mr. Zhu, do you agree?
Well, I don't think China right now wants to take that position. I think from China's perspective, United States is still way ahead. I think I just don't believe China wants to be part of G2. At the same time, I think China is likely to demonstrate a more pragmatic approach towards Japan, because as the second and the third largest economy, and these two countries, they have to talk to each other. And we often say you cannot choose your neighbors. And economically, these two countries are extremely complementary, economically complementary. And to be very frank, the recent conflict between China and Japan, from China's perspective, somehow the leadership sees U.S. as I don't want to use the term black hand, but I believe in this meeting, China and Japan will sit down to talk, and I believe relationship will see improvement going forward.
If I could just add to that, though, okay. One of the data shows that already the political tensions is already having a negative economic impact in relations between China and Japan. FDI from Japan to China has nearly halved. And instead it's shifting more towards Southeast Asia. If we do not see improvement, if there is continued tension, public opinion polls have shown that there is great fear of an underlying military threat that's percolating between the two countries because of the ongoing tensions, that an accident in the East China Sea may actually spiral into something that gets out of control. That kind of situation will have a tremendous negative economic impact. And so the baseline is that the two leaders need to talk and that they need to take responsibility for their actions.
And that's where we have to end it. Time's caught up with us. To our guests in Beijing, Mr. Sitao and Kerry Brown, who's talking to us from Australia. Thank you very much. And to our guests here in Washington, Mier, Shihoko Goto, thanks a lot for being with us.
Thank you.
And that is all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. Follow CCTV's in-depth coverage of the APEC summit on our website at cctv-america.com/APEC. You can also chat with us on Twitter at @CCTV_America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.